My read of the current evidence is that that tax reduced total soda purchases in the city of Philly by close to 50%.
Oh.
And then around half of that reduction reappeared outside the city as sort of cross-border purchases. So you go into Jersey or you go outside, you go up to the main line or wherever those taxes aren't in effect, and you buy your soda there instead. So some of it gets offset by that kind of cross-border shopping, but still that's something like a 25% reduction in total purchases.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today. Have you ever heard of a sin tax? It's a type of tax put forward by a city or a state primarily to add a cost to something that may not be the healthiest or the best for us. There have been sin taxes on things like soda, tobacco products, alcohol, and others. And there may even be growing in use to raise needed revenues. But do these sin taxes actually impact the public's thought process enough to change their behavior in using them? This is research conducted by Wharton's Ben Lockwood, who's an assistant professor of business economics and public policy, and he joins me here in the studio. Great to see you, Ben. Thanks for your time.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me on, Dan.
So the research looks in kind of the mindset of the people as these sin taxes are implemented and whether or not they actually have an impact on their purchasing habits?
Yeah, that's the idea. So I've done a couple of research papers in this area, sort of ranging from the general theory and an understanding of how sin taxes work and how effective they might be, when you might want to use them. Obviously, they're used on a bunch of different products, from alcohol to cigarettes to other forms of tobacco to now sometimes gambling or soda. And then more specifically, I've kind of zeroed in on a couple of particular types of sin taxes. One big set of projects on soda taxes, specifically another set of projects on gambling in the form of state-run lotteries, right. To kind of understand what the trade-offs were and what the behavioral effects were in those specific areas.
And so with the sin tax, and we've talked about it in the past, with here in Philadelphia, with the sin tax that was put into place, what kind of research do we know or impact do we know from having that on soda and whether or not it had an impact on sales here in Philadelphia?
Sure. So now it's been several years ago now, maybe close to a decade ago, Philadelphia implemented a 1.5 cents per ounce tax on sweetened beverages. So soda, but also diet soda and also some other kinds of, non-carbonated sweetened drinks. And 1.5 cents per ounce might not sound like a very large amount, but actually the average cost of soda in the U.S. is something like 4 to 5 cents per ounce, so something like a 30% tax. It's actually pretty substantial. Now there's enough of a track record, enough evidence over these last several years to kind of see what sort of effects that's had. My read of the current evidence is that that tax reduced total soda purchases in the city of Philly by close to 50%.
Wow.
And then around half of that reduction reappeared outside the city as sort of cross-border purchases. So you go into Jersey or you go outside, you go up to the main line or wherever those taxes aren't in effect, and you buy your soda there instead. So some of it gets offset by that kind of cross-border shopping, but still that's something like a 25% reduction in total purchases. So it's not trivial regardless.
But that's the interesting thing, is that people would even consider the fact of not buying their soda within the city limits, but they actually would go outside the borders. And I guess it's probably people who are probably close to the borders in general, go a mile, go 2 miles, whatever, to buy their soda and then bring it back into their residence in the city limits.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's people who sort of live close to the edges. I think there's some evidence for sort of being geographically close to the edges, and also being people who kind of chain their trips together and do a large set of purchases, at the Costco nearby or something, and then that's when you get all your soda. In the research that we do, one implication of them is if you do want to do this sort of sin taxation, it can be beneficial to try to implement those taxes at sort of a larger geographic area, because the smaller the area is that these taxes are confined in, the more you just lose any of their revenue raising ability and also any of their sort of desired behavioral effects to people who are just cross-border shopping.
So it's interesting you said that the amount of soda went down as much as it did. And again, that component of how much the tax is in comparison to how much a person might spend on a soda is very unique. And you wonder whether or not there's actual recognition by the public of the difference in cost because of that sin tax component itself.
Yeah, so you might wonder about this. And, often this is not specific to sin taxes. Often in economics generally, people are sort of surprised to find out that small price changes can nevertheless generate kind of a change in total behavior. So, the price of a $30,000 car goes up, or these days it's probably a $60,000 car, goes up by $1,000. And it's like, does anyone pay attention to that? But you can see in the data, demand curves slope down just like we teach in our MBA classes. And you can see in the data that there were some people who were a little bit on the margin between this and something else, or between buying now or waiting till next year or whatever, and you do see some effect in response to that. So this is sort of echoing those general results, that even small price changes do create changes in how much people purchase.
Can you determine then maybe even larger scale impact on health and maybe other components because of a lowering in the consumption, or at least the purchase of soda within the city of Philadelphia?
So you might be able to see this sort of thing eventually. Now, from the way that we think that health consequences of sugar consumption operate,
right,
you might not actually expect these things to materialize for 10 years down the road or something, with reductions in diabetes contraction. And even then, many people who lived in Philadelphia at the time might now live in Florida or somewhere else. So
right,
I would be surprised if we're able to pick up very much direct effect for sort of this quasi-experiment of the soda tax being implemented here. But there is evidence more generally of, the effects of sugar consumption on health down the road and other types of consumption. Certainly in the case of cigarettes, for example, there's a lot of evidence about the linkage between smoking and cancer.
But because of the connection that seemingly cities and states will have to these taxes, I guess it's probably not a surprise that you kind of alluded to before, the types of products that they may put a sin tax on is growing in the last few years as well.
Yeah, I think that's true, partly because there is this sort of growing realization that some products might have these health consequences or what have you. From an economics perspective, the way I think about this is not necessarily that you need to tax things just because they have harmful health consequences. I mean, there are lots of things that might be harmful for one's health, but people are aware of those harms and they're interested in doing the thing. We don't necessarily tax mountain biking or rock climbing just because they can be dangerous. The way I think about this is, if there is some aspect of a cost, a health cost or whatever else, that people aren't thinking about or aren't taking into account, either because of behavioral biases or because they aren't aware of the information or whatever, then what you want to try to understand is, if they were fully informed and if they really understood the context and the consequences and everything of all their actions, would they be consuming less than they currently are?
Right.
And if so, that's a situation where you might want to impose a tax to try to bring their actual consumption into line with what they might kind of rationally do if they took all those costs into account, in pretty much the same way that, we have this rationale for imposing a gas tax so that people take into account the negative externalities, the pollution consequences or the congestion consequences of buying gas, and bring it into line with.
But from a public policy perspective, these have become important revenue drivers for cities and states to be able to have them in the mix of their need to try and bring revenues to provide services in other areas as well.
It's true, and in a way, this is sort of one of the ironies of sin taxation generally, is I think they're sometimes looked to as a potential source of revenues. But of course, if part of the goal of the tax is to reduce people's consumption of something that might be harmful for them, then if the tax works well and people reduce their consumption a lot, then it necessarily doesn't bring in as much in revenue, right? So the way I think about the revenue question is that, whether you're talking about Philadelphia or the state of Pennsylvania or whatever jurisdiction, fundamentally the taxes that you bring in, that you need to bring in, are determined by the jurisdiction's spending decisions and their priorities. And then you're going to have to raise those, you're going to have to cover that spending one way or another. If you don't raise it via a soda tax, you're going to have to raise the sales tax or the personal income tax or something else. And really it's a question of which different things are we going to tax rather than, should we tax soda at all?
What do you think then the larger discussion is, and maybe it's a little bit of the health, a little bit of the taxation side of the impact that sin taxes are having in communities around the country?
So I think there are a couple pieces to this. One is the kind of behavioral consequence piece. Are people changing their behavior? Is that making them healthier or not? To what extent is it having an effect there? Another piece of it is, are there distributional consequences to this, which is sort of the fancy way that economists talk about, being really regressive or progressive with your tax choices. Are you going to tax poorer people much more heavily or richer people more heavily? One thing that we know about lots of these goods, soda, cigarettes, to some extent alcohol, is that they're more heavily consumed by people who are sort of lower in the income distribution. And so a thing you want to be aware of, thing you want to be careful of is, are you increasing taxes that are going to sort of fall most heavily on people who are poorer? Now, there are ways of offsetting that with making the income tax a little more progressive at the same time that you impose some sin taxes that in a way that sort of offsets that distributional impact, but it is something that you want to have in mind when you're deciding on these kinds of
so
tax
that you're
policies.
not really doubling up on the component of the tax. There's not a doubling of the impact on the people's wallets because of the tax being included as well.
That's right.
Yeah. What's your expectation then for looking at this research and taking it forward?
It's a good question. So there are a number of kind of increasing future areas of potential sin taxation that I think are becoming relevant. So some of these are, there's been an explosion in various forms of online gaming, sports betting, this kind of stuff. There's also increasing marijuana legalization, and that's viewed as a potential sin tax base. And so with those sorts of areas too, my question would be, to what extent are people buying those things or doing those activities more than they would if they were sort of fully rational or fully aware of the costs or fully cognizant of this stuff? A flip side of that is that I think that, sort of for political reasons, there's sometimes a drive to tax these new markets just because they don't have an entrenched body of stakeholders already that are existing and that can oppose a tax. Now, from an economist's point of view, that's not really a good reason to tax them, just that nobody is currently consuming them a whole lot. Really, you want to think about whether there are these, behavioral biases and what the revenue trade-offs are and that sort of thing.
But are we at a point right now where you do see sin taxes in a majority of states or a lot of communities or cities within states right now?
Yeah, most states have, if you look at the set of different sin taxes that are available, from lots of states have alcohol excise taxes, cigarette taxes. Many states have state-run lotteries, which I do think of as sort of a taxed good in the sense that the portion of the revenues are withheld before the prizes are paid back out, and that goes into the state's coffers. So between those things, you're at a point where most states and an increasing number of localities, of cities and smaller areas, are imposing these kinds of taxes too.
Ben, great to have you here. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Ben Lockwood, Assistant Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy here at the Wharton School. Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.